Imagine the scene. It's early 1397, and we're in a vast, echoing hall in the heart of London. Westminster Abbey is a sea of flickering candlelight, filled with the rustle of silk and the glint of jewels. Here, a girl of 7, barely tall enough to see over the great altar, is about to be crowned Queen of England. She is Isabella of Valois, daughter of the King of France. Her new husband, King Richard II of England, a man of 30, stands beside her. He's a king in his prime, his face already etched with the burdens of a divided kingdom. She is a child who by some accounts still played with dolls. The contrast is stark, and it's unsettling. This was not the beginning of a fairy tale. It was the public sealing of a desperate political bargain, a union forged in the cold calculus of power, designed to bind two warring nations and, in the process, seal the fate of a child caught in the merciless gears of history. To understand why a king would marry a child, you have to understand the world he was living in. The late 14th century was a time of incredible turmoil. For over 60 years, England and France had been locked in a bloody, exhausting conflict we now call the 100 Years' War. The war had become a way of life, draining the treasuries of both kingdoms and scarring the landscape with battlefields. Generations of men had known nothing but fighting. King Richard II inherited this mess, taking the throne as a boy of just 10 years old. His entire reign had been a constant struggle for authority. As a young king, he'd faced the massive peasants' revolt, staring down a rebel army when he was only 14. He was a complex figure, and a huge departure from his warrior grandfather, Edward III. Richard craved peace. He was a patron of the arts, a man who preferred diplomacy to the noise of battle, and he had this deep, almost mystical belief in the divine right of kings. He saw himself as God's chosen ruler, and he pictured an England defined not by endless war, but by culture, beauty, and his own absolute authority. His greatest desire was to finally end the war with France. This put him at odds with most of his own nobility. Many of England's powerful dukes and earls, including his own uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, saw the war as a source of wealth, land, and glory. To them, peace was just a fancy word for surrender, a betrayal of English ambition. They saw Richard's refined tastes and his habit of negotiating as signs of weakness, of an un-English character. And then there was Richard's personal life. He had been deeply in love with his first wife, and of Bohemia. Theirs was a real partnership, and when she died of the plague in 1394, the king was consumed by a grief so profound, it said he ordered the palace where she died to be torn down. For 2 years, he mourned, refusing to even think about remarrying. But the political reality of his kingdom couldn't be ignored. He needed an heir, and more than that, he needed a surefire way to cement his policy of peace. His personal grief had to take a back seat to his political strategy. A marriage to a French princess was the ultimate symbol of his commitment, a move that he knew would enrage his enemies but, in his mind, save his kingdom. Across the Channel, France wasn't doing much better. Its king, Charles VI, was known as Charles the Mad. He suffered from recurring bouts of a severe mental illness that could strike without warning, leaving him believing he was made of glass or failing to recognize his own wife and children. During these episodes, the French court would dissolve into chaos as powerful factions, led by his brother and uncles, fought for control. For them, a long-term truce with England was a godsend. It meant they could focus on their internal power struggles without worrying about an English invasion. A marriage alliance was the surest way to guarantee it. And King Charles just so happened to have a young daughter named Isabella. And so, the negotiations began. The stakes were immense, a truce that would last for 28 years, an unheard-of period of peace. It was a monumental goal, and at its very heart was the proposed marriage between the 29-year-old English king and the 6-year-old French princess. Isabella of Valois was born on November 9, 1389, in the Louvre Palace in Paris. As the daughter of a mentally unstable king and a politically ambitious queen, her childhood was anything but stable. She was a pawn from the moment she was born, her value measured not in her potential or personality, but in her royal blood. She was a living symbol, a piece to be played in the great game of European diplomacy. The English envoys who went to Paris to meet her reported back that she was a pretty, well-mannered child who carried herself with a grace well beyond her years. When told she was to be Queen of England, the young Isabella is said to have replied gravely, "I should be glad of it, for then I shall be a great lady." It's impossible to know if she truly understood what was happening. What must that have been like? To be a child of 6 and be told you're leaving everything you've ever known, your home, your family, your country, to marry a foreign king old enough to be your father. The marriage contract itself was a masterclass in medieval legal and religious gymnastics. It was meticulously drafted to deal with the obvious and unsettling issue of Isabella's age. Canon law prohibited the consummation of a marriage until the bride was 12. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a legally binding clause, and Richard agreed to it. The contract laid it all out: Isabella would go to England, be crowned queen, and live in her own separate household, but the marriage would not be physically completed for another 6 years. In exchange for his daughter, the King of France provided a massive dowry of 800,000 francs. It was a staggering sum, a true king's ransom that would help refill England's depleted treasury. But for the war-hungry nobles back in England, no amount of money could make up for what they saw as a national humiliation. They grumbled that their king was selling England's honor for a French bride and a hollow peace. Richard, however, stood his ground. He didn't see Isabella as a child bride in a predatory way, but as his ward. She was a blank slate, a French princess he could raise and mold into the perfect English queen, one who would be loyal only to him and who would represent the new era of peace he so desperately wanted. For him, the 6-year wait wasn't an inconvenience, it was an opportunity. The autumn of 1396 was a whirlwind of ceremony and travel for the young princess. The first stage of the marriage was a proxy ceremony in Paris, where an English nobleman stood in for his king. Then came the long, emotional journey to the coast. Isabella was formally handed over to her English escort, her life in France officially over. You can only imagine the tears and confusion of a 6-year-old girl, surrounded by strangers speaking a foreign language, as her entire world disappeared behind her. The official meeting between king and bride was a grandly staged political event. In late October, near Calais, which was English territory back then, 2 magnificent pavilions were set up. King Richard, flanked by the dukes and nobles of his court, rode out to meet his future queen. Isabella was brought forward by the French delegation, led by her own father, King Charles. According to the chronicler Jean Froissart, who recorded these events in detail, Richard approached the young girl, who had been coached on what to do. He was apparently charmed by her. He bent down to speak with her, and despite the strangeness of it all, seemed determined to put her at ease. On November 4, 1396, in the Church of St. Nicholas in Calais, Richard II and Isabella of Valois were formally married. She was just a few days shy of her 7th birthday. The ceremony was lavish, a spectacle of wealth and power designed to awe everyone who saw it. Richard, in his late 20s, made his vows to the small child standing beside him. It was a moment thick with political meaning and a deep, unavoidable strangeness. Here they were, the personification of their 2 nations' hopes for peace, a battle-weary king and a princess who hadn't even lost all her baby teeth. After the wedding, they traveled to London. The capital, while officially celebrating, was simmering with tension. The public's reaction was mixed. Many were awed by the pageantry and sheer expense of it all. But the whispers of discontent were impossible to miss. In taverns and marketplaces, people muttered their disapproval. The king had taken a French bride, the daughter of their ancient enemy, and she was just a child. What good was a queen who couldn't provide an heir for at least 6 more years? To many, it felt unnatural, even dangerous. Richard, ever the master of spectacle, ignored the naysayers. He was determined to present his new queen as a victory. Shortly after they arrived in London, Isabella was crowned Queen of England in a magnificent ceremony at Westminster Abbey in January 1397. Now 7 years old, she was dressed in robes of state, a crown placed carefully on her young head, and formally presented to the people. The image was powerful, but it couldn't hide the reality. She was a queen in name only, a child living in a world of adult ambitions, her life now tied forever to the fortunes of her much older husband. After all the pomp and ceremony died down, a strange new life began for Isabella. She wasn't a wife in any way we would understand. She was the Queen of England, and yet, she was still a child. Richard, to his credit, seems to have understood this delicate and bizarre situation. He set her up in a separate, lavish household at Windsor Castle, a place that became her gilded cage. She was surrounded by a retinue of ladies-in-waiting and attendants, including her trusted French governess, Lady de Cossey, who had come with her from Paris. Her days were a mix of lessons, playtime, and the formal training required of a future queen. She was a queen in miniature, practicing for the role she was born to play. Richard's treatment of her was, by all contemporary accounts, gentle and affectionate. He didn't treat her as a wife, but as something between a ward and a favorite daughter. He visited her often at Windsor. Chroniclers describe him spending hours with her, telling her stories, listening to her play music, and bringing her gifts. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in her company and was reportedly delighted by her sharp mind and formal manners. For Isabella, these visits from the king were likely the highlights of her isolated life. He was the center of her new world, the powerful, kindly figure who was her husband, her guardian, and her king, all at once. You get the sense that Richard was trying to create a loyal ally in a court filled with his enemies. He was shaping her, teaching her English ways, and preparing her for the day she would truly rule by his side. In this fragile, manufactured world, a genuine bond seems to have formed. Isabella, in turn, grew to adore him. She looked forward to his visits, and when he was away, she apparently spoke of him constantly. Their relationship was a tiny island of warmth in a cold sea of political calculation. She was his petite reine, his little queen, and he was her protector. But this strange domestic peace was built on political quicksand. Outside the walls of Windsor Castle, Richard's kingdom was starting to crumble. His peace treaty with France hadn't healed the divisions in his court, it had made them worse. The powerful nobles he had long distrusted saw the French marriage as the final proof that he was unfit to rule. They hated his reliance on a small circle of low-born favorites, his extravagant spending on art and fashion, and his increasingly authoritarian style. He was a king who demanded absolute obedience, and the lords of his realm, who believed their own power was just as sacred, were not about to give it. The very peace that Isabella's marriage was supposed to secure was becoming a catalyst for war, not with France, but within England itself. The years of Isabella's quiet, strange childhood at Windsor were years of rising political fury in England. King Richard's belief in his own absolute power was putting him on a collision course with the most powerful men in his kingdom. He had never forgiven a group of nobles known as the Lords Appellant, who had humiliated him years earlier by executing several of his closest friends and forcing him to bend to their will. Now, as an established king with a French peace treaty at his back, he decided it was payback time. In 1397, the same year Isabella was crowned, Richard struck. He arrested 3 of the most prominent Lords Appellant. One, the Earl of Arundel, was swiftly tried and executed. Another, the Earl of Warwick, was exiled. The third, his own uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, was arrested and taken to Calais, where he died under mysterious circumstances, almost certainly murdered on the king's orders. It was a ruthless purge, a clear signal that Richard would no longer tolerate any opposition. He wasn't a boy to be managed by his uncles anymore, he was an absolute monarch. The kingdom was shocked. Richard was now ruling by fear, surrounding himself with a small clique of loyalists whom he elevated with new, grand titles. He seemed to be building a new nobility from scratch, one that depended entirely on him. The final, and most fateful, move came against 2 other men he saw as threats, his own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, son of the powerful John of Gaunt, and Thomas de Mowbray, the Duke of Norfolk. Richard engineered a dispute between them and, instead of letting them settle it in a duel, he banished them both, Norfolk for life, and Bolingbroke for 10 years. Then, in 1399, Henry Bolingbroke's father, John of Gaunt, died. Gaunt was the wealthiest man in England, and his vast inheritance, the Duchy of Lancaster, was supposed to pass to his exiled son, Henry. In a move of staggering arrogance and greed, Richard II cancelled Bolingbroke's legal inheritance and seized the massive Lancastrian estates for the crown. This was a step too far. It was a blatant violation of the hereditary rights that the entire aristocratic system was built on. If the king could just disinherit his own cousin, what was stopping him from taking anyone's land or title? Richard had alienated his natural allies and shown himself to be a tyrant who operated outside the law. He had made a powerful and popular enemy in Henry Bolingbroke, and he had given that enemy the perfect reason to rebel. As Richard prepared for a military campaign in Ireland, he was completely oblivious to the danger brewing back home. He left his kingdom vulnerable, confident in his own untouchable authority. It was a fatal miscalculation. While King Richard was away in Ireland in the summer of 1399, the moment his enemies had been waiting for arrived. Henry Bolingbroke, breaking his exile, landed with a small force on the Yorkshire coast. He announced that he hadn't come to claim the throne, only to reclaim his rightful inheritance. It was a brilliant piece of propaganda. Disaffected nobles, who feared Richard's tyranny, flocked to his banner. What began as a small band of followers quickly swelled into an unstoppable army. The country rose up against its absent king. The news that reached Richard in Ireland was devastating. The regent he had left in charge couldn't stop Henry's advance and had ultimately joined him. Richard's entire support structure had evaporated. He rushed back to England, but it was too late. His army deserted him, and he found himself isolated and hunted in Wales. For the 9-year-old Queen Isabella, the world turned upside down almost overnight. As the rebellion gained steam, she was moved from her comfortable life at Windsor and placed under guard. Her French attendants were dismissed. Suddenly, she was a prisoner, isolated from everyone she knew and trusted. The king, her protector, her friend, the central figure in her life, was gone. You can only imagine the terror and confusion for a child who couldn't possibly understand the complex politics behind it all. All she knew was that her husband was in danger and her world had been shattered. The end came swiftly. Richard was captured and brought to London as a prisoner. He was forced to sign a deed of abdication in the Tower of London, giving up his crown to the man who had overthrown him. In front of Parliament, Henry Bolingbroke laid claim to the throne of England, becoming King Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned in the remote and forbidding Pontefract Castle. He wouldn't survive the winter. In February 1400, it was announced that the former king was dead, most likely from starvation, though the exact circumstances remain a mystery. He was just 33 years old. The king who had married a child to secure peace had been destroyed by a war he created at home. And his child queen was now a child widow, a captive in the hands of her husband's enemy. With Richard dead and Henry Bolingbroke now King Henry IV, new and awkward problem popped up: what to do with Isabella. At just 10 years old, she was the Dowager Queen of England, the living symbol of a deposed regime, and the daughter of the King of France. She was a political liability and a diplomatic headache. Henry IV's first plan was a pragmatic one: marry Isabella to his own son and heir, the future King Henry V. The young Prince Hal was a few years older than Isabella, and the marriage would have been a brilliant political move. It would have transferred her legitimacy to the new dynasty, kept the peace with France, and allowed England to hold on to her massive dowry. But Henry IV hadn't counted on the fierce loyalty of a child. When Isabella was told of Richard's death, she refused to believe it. She fell into a deep state of grief and openly mourned the husband she had adored. When the new King's Council proposed the marriage to the Prince of Wales, she flatly refused. No one, she declared, could ever replace her husband, the true king. Her defiance was extraordinary. Here she was, a child prisoner in a foreign land, surrounded by enemies, yet she refused to be used as a pawn. Her public and unwavering loyalty to Richard's memory became a quiet but powerful symbol of resistance to the usurper king. Her stubborn refusal put Henry IV in a tight spot. He couldn't force her into the marriage without causing a major diplomatic incident with France. The French court, now recovering from the shock of Richard's overthrow, began demanding the return of their princess, along with her jewels and her entire 800,000 franc dowry. For 2 years, the negotiations dragged on. Henry was reluctant to let go of the dowry, a fortune his new, unstable government desperately needed. But holding the French king's daughter hostage wasn't exactly a sustainable foreign policy. Finally, in 1401, they reached a compromise. Isabella would be allowed to return home. A portion of her jewels would be sent back with her, but the English would hold on to the cash from her dowry, a sore point that would sour relations between the two kingdoms for years. For Isabella, it was the end of her English chapter. She had arrived as a princess, been crowned a queen, and was now leaving as a widow, her life irrevocably altered by the brutal Game of Thrones. Isabella's return to France in the summer of 1401 wasn't a triumphant homecoming. She was now a piece that had been played and removed from the board. The French court she returned to was just as treacherous and divided as the one she had left. Her father's madness continued to plague the kingdom, and the rival factions of Burgundy and Orleans were inching ever closer to open civil war. For 5 years, she lived in a state of limbo. She was a Dowager Queen of England, a title that carried little weight in France. She was a valuable marriage prospect, but her future remained uncertain. Finally, in 1406, another political match was made for her. At 16, she was married to her cousin, Charles, the Duke of Orleans. He was a poet and a prominent figure in the French court, and just 11 years old at the time of their wedding. Once again, Isabella found herself married to a boy, her life dictated by the strategic needs of her family. This marriage, unlike her first, seems to have been a happy one. Charles adored his young wife, and for a brief moment, it looked like Isabella might finally find some measure of personal happiness. But her story was always destined for tragedy. In 1409, at the age of just 19, Isabella gave birth to a daughter, Joan. The childbirth was difficult, and she never recovered. She died shortly after, her life cut short before she had even reached her 20th birthday. Her death was a quiet end to a life that had begun with such international fanfare. The peace she was supposed to guarantee had shattered. Within a few years, her former suitor, Prince Hal, now King Henry V of England, would reignite the 100 Years' War with a ferocity that dwarfed everything before it, famously crushing the French at the Battle of Agincourt. Her second husband, Charles of Orleans, would be captured at that very battle and spend the next 25 years as a prisoner in England, writing mournful poetry. The world Isabella was sacrificed to create never even came to be. Isabella of Valois' life was a complete paradox. She was a central figure in the politics of her day, yet she was utterly powerless. She was a queen who never ruled, a wife who was never a partner, and a child forced to navigate an adult world of breathtaking cruelty. Her story is a stark, uncomfortable reminder of the human cost of political ambition. She was treated as a symbol, a vessel for the hopes and strategies of powerful men. But she was also a person, a lonely little girl in a foreign castle, a grieving child widow, and a young woman who found a fleeting moment of happiness before it was all taken away. Her story is largely forgotten, just a footnote in the dramatic reigns of kings. But in her short, tragic life, we see the brutal reality that lay beneath the gilded surface of royal power. It's a world where peace is bought with the innocence of children, and where the lives of individuals, even those who wear crowns, are ultimately disposable. The king who married a child to stop a war couldn't save himself, and in the end, he couldn't save her either. They were both just swept away by the tides of history, leaving behind a haunting story of a fragile world that was never meant to last.